Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, MRQA from Radiotherapy Perspective. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You've joined the presentation listening through your computer speaker system by default. To adjust your audio, just select different speakers, select the settings wheel at the top right of the GoToWebinar window. You may also enable closed captioning for this presentation by clicking the CC icon located towards the right bottom of your window. Today's webinar is sponsored by IBA and presented by Akush Ugban, a medical physicist at Jules Bordet Institute, who welcomes your questions. And you could submit your questions throughout the presentation by typing them into the questions panel. To access this panel, click the questions icon at the top right. Akush will answer as many as possible during the Q&A session, and any remaining questions will be answered by email once the webinar is over. So it's now my pleasure to introduce your speaker, Akush.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Can you hear me? Can you see me? I should assume that you are able to hear me. So
yes, we can.
Okay, thank you very much. So with further ado, thank you very much for joining this seminar. I try to make my best to make this 30 minutes really about the QA that we introduced in our institution, because we started with most of the centers from scratch, assessing how we are going to tackle the quality assurance for MR, especially when we have an MR simulator and then also MR Unity Linac. So I have to also declare that I don't have any financial interest related to this seminar or other things that I need to declare. However, I should mention that our institution has a research contract with Elekta, Siemens, and IBA, so you might be seeing this as a potential conflict of interest. I also have to correct directly the title because I can't speak on behalf of the entire radiotherapy domain. I can only speak about how we introduced it and what is our perspective, that how we should tackle these challenges in radiotherapy domain. A little bit about our background and where we are located. So we are located in Europe, in Belgium. This is the capital of Belgium. We have a relatively small team. However, we have a quite large variety of different techniques. So we introduced the MR Linac basically 2021 at the new campus. And also the same year, we had received also an MR simulator dedicated to radiotherapy. So my first take-home message also related to this one, like if you see how many techniques we have and what size of the group we have, then you should be able to see that even with this average or small team, this is also feasible to introduce it into the clinical routine. When I started at this institution, I was assigned to the MRI in radiotherapy in general, and I was a little bit lost to see like, okay, how am I going to enter from radiotherapy background into MRI? So having all these buzzwords, how I'm interpreting it, how much I need to tackle it. But the first thing that was coming into my mind that I have to remind myself that we are not talking about MRI with a direct attenuation-based imaging like any topographic images. This is something that it makes a big difference. So you can't place an object into an MRI and then assume that there is a projection and that will handle everything. So I was a little bit lost at the beginning. And then you are gathering basically three components how you are tackling this labyrinth of MRI. The first thing is that certainly a certain degree of knowledge is necessary to acquire. You have to have certain tools available for you. And then the most important one to me is the willingness that you want to tackle this on head, and then you want to prepare with all this information, ammunition to go to the next level. This is the idea that I really want to emphasize, that it took me the most time during this preparation, because what you would see is that the most difficult part for tackling MRI is that when you look at the diagnostic MRI, then so many options, so many interpretations, so many changes. And of course, that has a purpose of like assessing tumor involvement, assessing tumor extent from a diagnostic purpose. However, if we are trying to embark on radiotherapy usage, then we could add certain RT-oriented sequences, which helps the co-registration, interpretation, using it for general purpose of target delineation or even organs at risk. And all these steps, if you are moving directly towards the final MR-guided radiotherapy, all these steps are shrinking down the variations that you should absorb. So if you go down and then at the end you want to treat your MRI as a primary image for the treatment decision or treatment planning, that means that certain degree of standardization, and I mean standardization by reducing the variations that you are applying for your protocols, that should be emphasized. And then along the way, that is more you are tailoring these sequences to the needs that you need at the clinical application. On the other hand, while you are trying to make your radiation oncologist absolutely happy, and I have some indicators here that you can't really achieve full happiness for the radiation oncologist, at the same time you have to think about like what kind of quality assurance you require to do in order to enable those kind of techniques at the radiotherapy department. So in other words, the frequency and the extent of the quality assurance program that might need to be evaluated according to the needs. So if you are facing with a typical situation for most of the centers that you have access maybe to diagnostic MRI for the dedicated slots, then you might not need to do like a very extensive multiple days QA in order to secure that you are using the MRI along with the reference primary image set from planning CT. You have to make sure that for the use that you are using, this is adequately controlled. And then also there is like a basic quality assurance that is performed also by the field service engineers from the different companies or the technologist from the radiology department. So my next step, take-home message that I would like to emphasize for you is basically that whenever you are applying more the MRI in radiotherapy use, it comes anyhow with more standardization. And this standardization is helping also to assess like what we are changing from the previous steps and how that is impacting the quality assurance that you need to emphasize. And just a reminder that we started basically in a very superficial way in 2019 with our first measurements on the MRI diagnostic scans in the previous campus, in the old campus. And then once we moved to the new one, we had to directly tackle the installation of the MRI Linac. So we started directly head-on with the most tailored MRI is used as an adaptation tool for the daily treatment. And that was emphasized by also with a different vendor. So if I'm taking it from this aspect, then you have to think about like, okay, what is the biggest difference from QA perspective? The biggest difference is that if you purchase an MRI Linac, then the vendor is on board with you, that you are not alone. There are some protocols. The vendor needs to make sure that the MRI images is like extremely nicely presented and it's reliable and it's standardized. And they are also proposing associated tests in order to guarantee that what they are proposing and declaring that this machine works under these conditions, that condition is repeatable and also measurable, and it is meeting the vendor specification. However, if you are purchasing an MR simulator, most of the time it is handled like an extra MRI machine in radiotherapy department. That means that you don't necessarily have associated vendor specification, because the vendor is leaving you the floor, like however you want to tackle this one. And this is basically how we changed the perspective, is that we knew that what we have to do for the most complicated situation for the MR Linac, and we used all those knowledge and all those perspectives to go back and to say like, okay, how we are addressing the MR simulator in a similar fashion. So just to have like a very superficial link to the basic test that we are absolutely performing with the frequency, there is always an association what you should do in your classical CT, CBCT Linacs. And then what is the equivalent of that kind of test for the MR Linac and the MR simulator. So practically what you have to consider is like, for the isocenter verifications, you are doing it most likely on a daily basis because that is associated with the precision how you are administrating dose to the patient. And the same thing applies for the MR Linac. So the vendor in this situation is supplying us the tools, the analysis, and then also the recommendation and the specification that we have to meet. And if you are entering into the image quality zone, then most likely you are using the Las Vegas Phantom for MV. Most likely you are using for the Combeam seated the CAT fan, independent of the vendor. And then also this is giving you also like a geometric fidelity as well. And the same thing applies for the MR Linac, that you have to rely on the image with high precision, with very restrictive errors. And the same thing, you have to measure like a general image quality in a very restrictive fashion, in a very high frequency, and then also the same thing for the geometrical accuracy of the Phantom. However, when you are entering into MR simulator, you are having more freedom selecting the tools. But what we try to establish as well, to have like a vendor neutral bridge between the MR simulator and the MR Linac. And that helps us to evaluate like, okay, what we are anticipating in one side with a very clear specification, how that is impacting basically the MR simulator in a similar fashion. In other words, how you can repeat the same type of exercise and QC in a vendor neutral fashion. And this is also something that I would like to emphasize, that you have different tests, you have different tools. Please, this is the best advice I can give you. Please take your time to evaluate what you need and how you can streamline it. The worst thing that you can do is to have like the perfect tool and you are spending hours and hours just to get to the results and the analysis, or if you are overwhelmed with too much information and you can't shrink it down, how you can propose it. My go-to evaluation is basically like, if I'm doing a quality assurance, that how can I reply to the questions of the radiation oncologist, like, should we be concerned about this? Should we be concerned about that? What happens if this fails? What happens if that fails? How we are detecting this or that? And if I'm putting this through, and then also you want to have like a very transparent way of holding this information, so please, on all costs, avoid multiple Excel sheets for certain things that you will mix up, you will lose it. There is not an updated version. So please try to do something that it's really streamlined. And this is really an important thing to emphasize, especially if you have like limited time, limited number of personnel, but still you have like a lot of variations in terms of technique that you have to support. So tackling the different QA tools, the first one is like, we have to measure basically the isocenter of the machine. And when you are talking about simulator, you have one single isocenter, and that isocenter is basically the isocenter of the acquisition. If you are talking about MR Linac, then you have two isocenters, one for the imaging system from the MRI and one for the MV, so basically the irradiation isocenter. And this is the consequence how we are tackling it, that we are performing this test, the daily MR to MV isocenter verification on a daily basis in a very strict protocol. And we have very sensitive and highly accessible automatic analysis, so we can detect sub-millimeter accuracy or mismatch, because this is linked to like, you have an MRI image, and based on that MRI image, you are directly making an adaptation of multiple patients on the same day. So if this is not in order, the images that you are generating, they are not aligned the irradiation pathways. So this is an absolute direct consequences that you should take into consideration, and this is why this is like an absolute need to measure it on a daily basis. However, if you move to the MR simulator. The MR simulator, especially if you are not using MR as a primary image, but just a secondary image, we are also using these kind of MR markers, which has a longitudinal distance of 20 millimeters and a diameter of 2-3 millimeters. So you can imagine that if this is your MR marker, because you want to make sure that this marker is visible on the acquisitions that you perform, then even though that you have 1-2 millimeters error on the acquisition isocenter, this will not impact the usage of the MR images, because the marker itself, it's also like so large. But we have an external laser system, and we still performed an evaluation, like we are using this for aligning the patients. We are putting the markers exactly based on that laser. So that laser should be in alignment with the machine isocenter. And what could go wrong, basically, like after certain changes of the machine, after maintenance, this could move slightly, but the consequence clinically is probably less pronounced, because we are not using to make adaptive decision, especially in a submillimetric fashion. So again, the big difference here is the accuracy requirement, and the second thing is that the consequence of the inaccuracy. And then there is a second biggest difference, is that you are supplied with a automated analysis in one side for the MR Linac, but this is lacking at the choice of the MR simulator for the laser system. But the biggest question is like how frequently you want to measure this one. And I will come back to this question, like, because this is a single purpose phantom. You are measuring just the accuracy of the isocenter in both situations. And if you are moving to the general quality assurance for the image quality, this is again the tricky part, because you want to make sure that your MRI images performed are consistent and they're providing the same signal. And we have two tests that we are usually doing. For the MR Linac, there is a vendor supply test. It's called a periodic image quality test with a multi-purpose phantom. I can say that this is more or less the equivalent of the CAT-FAN for the CT or CBCT system, but for MRI. You have multiple tests, what you want to perform on a daily basis under a very strict condition. What I can tell you that in the first week when we started to do these measurements, we repeated multiple times the setup, because there were like few millimeter mismatch, and we couldn't find the right starting point, and the system was complaining about it. Which means that this phantom is not only verifying basic image quality purposes, but also indirectly checking for the isocenter. So now we are smarter than at the beginning. So we put basically markers. That means that this test indirectly also checking the MRI isocenter. And once we acquire this knowledge, moving back to the MR simulator, that was like pretty straightforward. We acquired also ACR phantom. The ACR phantom, for the moment, it's a little bit of a headache, because you have to measure all these things in a manual fashion, because the phantom itself can vary between different vendors. So all these tests, it's difficult to automatize and then also to trace it. But still you can measure individually what is required by the ACR. But the question is like, what is the purpose of all these measurements? Is basically you want to have like a traceability under same conditions. If you are repeating the same test, this remains consistent. And for me, the most rewarding point was when we talked to the Philips field service engineer, and then he was coming first time. We are the only installation of Unity MR Linac in Belgium. So he was coming for the second maintenance, and then he was asking like, are we performing the PIQT on a weekly basis? And we said like, we are doing it on a daily basis. And he said, oh, I wish every customer would do the same thing, because that makes our life much easier, because then we have an interface saying like, was there any problem with the machine? And then if you don't measure, you don't know. But at least these tests are sensitive enough just to give you an idea. If I'm not lowering the anterior antenna of the MR Linac, this test would fail, which means that the restriction under what conditions we are measuring is extremely high. However, for the ACR, it is like up to you how we are measuring it, how we are standardizing it. I'm in the process of trying to make a more consistent evaluation on that one, which is like user independent. But again, since the ACR is also sharing the same principles, you have to position it properly. Otherwise, you are missing the slice that is assigned to the specific test that you want to perform. And now to the biggest topic, that if you are talking a radiation oncologist about the MRI, the first thing that they will ask, what about the distortion? And then the question you can ask back like, yes, what about it? Because they know that in radiology, there are certain situations and only a 2D distortion correction applied, because they want to have like a crisp image in plane, but they don't care that between planes what is happening. However, the first rule of MR in radiotherapy that you will hear directly is that distortion correction and 3D acquisitions, which means that you really want to have like a very fast imaging and very large field of view as much as possible in order to make like a registration between the planning CT and the MRI or MR in RT in position of treatment, that you want to have like perfect alignment. And if you're taking this consideration, and I'm crediting the colleague from Wisconsin, that basically you have to understand that the 3D correction is the one that we want to apply most of the time. So if you go back to your protocols, if you have access to MR protocol, then you have to check that whatever you are doing, that you want to use it perfectly for radiotherapy purpose, then the 3D distortion correction should be applied. But this is something that we can further discuss a little bit, that what you have to consider, that this is a geometric correction specific to the machine and to the vendor basically. This is usually independent from the signal that you are trying to achieve. There is a slight bandwidth dependence, but what you have to consider, like when this could potentially change, if there is like a maintenance or intervention with the machine, and there is like a frequency recalibration or a shimming adjustment. What you have to keep in mind, what is the limitation of this correction, is that any magnetic susceptibility is not measured by this or not corrected by this, because this is really specific to the object that is inside the bore. And then even though that you know that this exists, it is not corrected 100%. And in certain situations, what I'm trying to use as a thumb of rule is that if the radiation oncologist is asking, like, should I be concerned for this particular patient about the distortion-related error? Should I add extra margin due to that one? And this was one of the key elements how we tackled also the evaluation of the distortion. And this was also leading us to, like, this is just an example, that is it something that you should be thinking about? And absolutely yes. This is just two representation in three planes, like if you are applying the correction or not. And then as you can see that very narrowly speaking, that there is like almost a perfect correction within this box. But if you are going up to 5 millimeter error, then you have like quite a volume if there is no correction applied. And this was also bringing us like how we should tackle this one, because if you projected it from the distance from the isocenter, you have like multiple points. Then what is the error that you might introduce? And this is from a measurement from a 3 Tesla Siemens machine with a 3D correction applied. And we can see that in a very extreme situation away from the isocenter, that most of the points are well within the 2-3 millimeter distortion. And then basically what you want to do is always assign this correction. And how we are tackling this on the MR Linac MR simulator. Then for the MR Linac, there was a supplied geometry QA phantom with automated analysis, which is also very sensitive for automated QA analysis, but it's also checking the ISO center indirectly. So that means that if you are not positioning it systematically on the right spot, you will have a problem. And then for the phantom for our choice for the quality assurance for the simulator, it was also the QUASAR IBA MRD 3D. It's not a catchy name, I think, but after all, this is it, because it has like a large field of view that we need to do. It has like a full point cloud evaluation. So virtually it is feeding with the harmonic analysis multiple points into the space. And there is like a supplied software for analysis. And you can also tailor the needs, what you want to evaluate in what space in a virtual fashion. The only backside that you might end up is that the software analysis is linked to your MR machine. So you have to have specific license for each machines that you want to do. And there is also like a cherry on the cake that you have also like an evaluation of your setup accuracy. So what we can do is basically we are doing a weekly basis of the geometry phantom with the designed one for the MR Linac. And for the MR simulator, we are basically doing every 3 months or so, or after maintenance, an extra evaluation. And occasionally, we are also verifying that the Unity is meeting the same requirements with another phantom as well. So I think that here this is like an overshooting, but at least we have like an idea that how much distortion difference we have between the MR Linac and the MR simulator. So this is just one example that you can see that in a MR Linac world, you have like a very straightforward and highly supported setup. Basically, you have trending directly incorporated into the system, and then also like an automated analysis. And I think this is like perfectly suitable for the need because we have like a limited field of view as well. And now I am entering into a little bit more details about the MRI 3D phantom. But I think if you want to have like all the details, all the specification, you should really check this webinar, which is available also in YouTube, because that is entering into a lot of details about this phantom in terms of like why and how it was designed and what is the evaluation that you can pull out of it. So I'm inviting you to, if you want to have more details about it, then please check this link, but I will not repeat most of the time the same thing. So this is basically the interface that you will face if you are using this system. We have like an evaluation. I selected the last 60 days for all the phantoms that all the QA that we did for the different vendors. And then afterwards you have like a simple evaluation tools that you can project it or a 3D. Usually what we are evaluating is basically a certain threshold, and we are tackling the absolute distortion away from the ISO center, and we are also making a good use of the ROID selection. And this is something that empowers us in order to tailor what we want to evaluate and what are the questions and how we are using the MR simulator. And how we got the inspiration for that one is basically like a presentation in MR in RT from Utrecht 2019. So I'm linking this via that was provided there, that what you have to consider when you are treating certain pathologies, what are the distortions that you might need to accommodate. And as you can see that certain situation, especially if you have like a very lateralized breast tissue, then you might breast tumor, then you might need to consider like a large distortion error, because this is like an edge of the field of view that you need to tackle. So this is how we basically entered into this domain with the 3 assigned ROIs that we are trying to evaluate. Because the first question was like, what happens if you have intracranial treatments or head and neck treatments? Then we have to be really restrictive, and there is like also no rooms for error. So we selected a ROI that is associated with this kind of geometry around the isocenter, so with a 20 centimeter diameter, and centrally located around the isocenter of the machine with a very restrictive protocol. And as you can see, that there is like submillimetric distortion happening within this space. If we are moving to the MR Linac, you have to know that there is like limitations in field size. So you have like a longitudinal field size of 22 centimeters, depending on if you are doing a QA measurements or a clinical adaptation. So that means that there is no point to include points outside of this region around the isocenter. But since we do an adaptation, so we need to cover the entire external diameter of the patient. So we are taking a large cylindrical region of interest. And then we had to apply a certain offset. And I will come back to that one later. And we are using a general idea that we want to have less than 1 millimeter, because this is more or less the same 1 millimeter declaration of the machine specification that needs to be respected by the geometric QA phantom. And then recently we started also like primary images from the MR simulator, namely the synthetic CT for pelvis patients. And there we have to have like an extremely large field of view, almost the maximum field of view that we can acquire. Therefore, we acquiring the entire volume of the phantom. But there is a catch that you can also position the phantom properly at the level of the isocenter of the machine, because you have like feet adjusted to that specific table. And then afterwards you can measure very similarly. However, you might end up like in certain regions you have higher distortion, especially in the longitudinal region. So you have to keep in mind that one. Why we are doing this? This is one of the examples that we have the ORFID system associated with our head coils. So with the two flexi coils with the ORFID mask system. And this is what we are using, especially with the large distortion phantom. However, our clinic is also having a gamma knife unit, and in the gamma knife there is like one big difference compared to this setup, that you have basically a gamma knife frame attached to the patient. And this frame is basically introducing a magnetic susceptibility, which you can't imitate with this phantom. So in that situation, we are using basically the grid 3D, because that you can place it inside the frame, and you can have like not only the machine performance for correction, but also machine correction with the frame inside the bore. And that is really important for stereotactic or gamma knife specific measurements. So this is something that you have to consider, like if you are doing frame-based stereotactic treatments, even in classical Linac, this might be something that you want to use, especially if you are using it in a highly targeting regions, because basically in gamma knife, the MRI can be considered as a primary image. And coming back to the MR Linac setup, basically the point is that you have like a specific tool that you can place the phantom inside the bore exactly at the level of isocenter, which requires extreme careful locations and then also very precise and small manual movements. And that means that most of the time that you are spending with this QA is that placing the phantom exactly at that spot. And in terms of convenience, basically what we did is that we placed the phantom on the table, so we can precisely move in a longitudinal fashion, and it's also not tilted, not rolled, not pitched. That means that the setup is a few seconds instead of a few 10 minutes, and we can move this phantom directly into the isocenter, but we know what is the level from the table to the isocenter level, so we are adjusting basically the evaluation to accommodate for this one. And this is basically a convenient factor. And when I'm projecting also the same kind of distributions, you might see that in an anterior fashion, we are outside of the region of interest with this cylindrical region of interest that we select. But we don't concern about this part because we are anyhow using it for the placement of the antenna. And if we move back to the MR simulator with a similar phantom, this is just a reminder that, okay, the 3D distortion correction is applied. That means we don't have any distortion even in the extreme situation. And as an extra bonus, we also have like a correction or evaluation of the isocenter. So you can see that basically you have a slight offset, but this is something that the system is detecting and then providing as well. So my next take-home message is basically like try to optimize as well. You have one phantom, you have a very nice analysis tool, explore what is the clinical needs that you need to use, and then also apply the same principle. And this is something that you can apply with this phantom as well, and then we are quite happy about it, that you have like 3 different evaluations based on a single measurement. And this is something that you can consider like as an advantage, because I don't see much other options that you can do. We have also 2 other different tools for distortion evaluation, but one is without extra software supplied, or you are paying for the evaluation of the distortion per use. And you can have like an idea that, okay, here you have an upfront link to the license to the MR machine, and in the other situations you might end up like you are paying for doing the analysis every time that you perform the test. I don't know whichever you prefer, but we made our choice to select this phantom as well. And then this is just one general extra message that you want to consider as well. Like the MR Linac was really helping us to introduce quality assurance in the MR world. And then also what you have to think, like you can read a lot of articles, you can read a lot of tests. You have to shrink it down and also say like what is feasible, what is necessary, and it's up to you to decide. And then if you are a little bit concerned about like, okay, we don't have like a full perfect solution, my advice is that just start with something and you can build up your knowledge by doing a basic evaluation at the beginning, and you will be able to gain confidence in that particular situation. Because at the end, whatever you are doing, if you can defend it, okay, this is why we are doing it in this fashion, that should be sufficient. And then also you should feel confident that, okay, this is something that is sufficient enough to secure the use of MR in radiotherapy. So these are just to repeat the same thing, that don't be afraid if you have like a smaller team, because this is something that you can absorb in a regular fashion, because you have to know that whatever standardization is happening on MRI, that will help you to take more advantage in radiotherapy, and then also link to the use how much QA is necessary to do that one. And I did 4 steps, basically MR in radiology, if you are switching to MR in radiotherapy, only in radiotherapy protocols, if you are switching to use the MRI as primary image, and then the latest one is for MR-guided adaptive radiotherapy. Also that the QA burden, don't underestimate how much time you will spend on the post-processing if you don't have supply tools to do so, and if you don't have repository to place the end of the results. And then the quality checks, I think that this is making a wonderful friendship with the field service engineers, if you can show like you are taking care of the machine whenever they are not there. And then also the next one, the geometric distortion, it's really a powerful tool, especially if you have like unusual situations, and you can provide information to the radiation oncologist like, within this distance, we are confident that the image is properly represented on the MRI, so we don't have to care about it for the distortion. Or, in other words, there was also discussion to treat like breast patients in the MR Linac. Then we specifically said like, with this distance, most likely we need to add 1 millimeter or 2 millimeter extra margin. We never treated patients on that one, but that was the discussion. And based on these measurements that we provided, you can have like a tailored ROI that is associated with that distance from the isocenter. And then just some closing words, because I'm running out of my time, that if you go beyond the daily adaptive radiotherapy, we are entering also the domain of gating with the MR Linac since last October. Then you have to have more standardization, because then you are tailoring it more under conditions that you can repeat, and then you need extra tools that can measure this kind of quality assurance. And beyond that one, when it's not only technical, but also like decision making for referring the patients to certain treatments or dose escalations or dose de-escalation, then you have also the functional imaging of the MRI, and that is one of the most prominent part that you can take advantage or incorporate in the future QA. And this is one of the paper from one of my colleagues who did basically like more standardization was applied by an imaging protocol, and then she was visiting different centers with the same diffusion weighted QA phantom, and to see like, okay, what is the repeatability, what is the reproducibility. And this is something that you have to look forward, because this will come in multiple ways into the daily routine of MR in radiotherapy. And basically this is the message, this is the propositions and the QA that I wanted to share with you, and I'm more than happy to answer all the questions that you come up with. Thank you very much.
Okay, now it's time for Q&A. So Akush, if you would want to go ahead and start with your first question.
Yeah, I have this questions, like you mentioned the radiation oncologist happiness indicator. What are the most common sources of unhappiness still seen today? So yeah, I think that what you have to consider is like with this standardization, there are some trade-offs all the time. And I think one of the trade-offs that we see at the moment is that in certain specific localization, talking about, for instance, liver tumors, that the provided standardized protocols on the MR Linac are not wide enough or not flexible enough in order to visualize properly all type of tumors that we want to see. And since we do also simulations on the MR simulator for the same patients, sometimes we see preferences over the Unity sequences by the diagnostically oriented or the Siemens protocols. And I think this is something that we should emphasize. The second question is like, what consideration go into the selecting the ROI when assessing distortion, especially given the shift between the phantom and the machine isocenter. So again, this is like a absolutely practical approach, that if you can spend 10 minutes on the proper setup at the isocenter, while you can set it up in under 1 minute and do the measurements and later on applying the offset, I think that considering that you don't want it to occupy the machine more than it's necessary, I think this is like a very acceptable trade-off to do in this kind of fashion. Okay, going this one, I can delete then. Next one. Selecting ROIs. Okay, this is already done. With increased QA requirements as we move towards MR guided radiotherapy, what advice you give to centers just beginning this transition? Well, start somewhere. Start with at least 2 different type of phantoms. One is for general image quality and the other one is for distortion specific, and then take your time. This is really take your time, that how you want to incorporate it, assess it before you are even doing any purchase. Don't just go along with so this is very important, that you want to have like a automated analysis behind it, because you will spend hours and hours, not repeatable way if you are doing it in a manual fashion. Okay. how close we are to achieving multicentric standardization for MR protocols in radiotherapy across institutions. We are slowly getting there. So if you look at Siemens is also providing a multiple magneton word special edition in RT. They are refreshing it every year. They are providing certain points that you have to take into consideration. What is also helping, I think, from Elekta Unity users, that there are more demands, and Philips is working really hard to live up to that part. But if you want to have like vendor independent one, I would really suggest that you are searching for the Gentle Radiotherapy Handbook. This was like a multicentric project in multi-vendor projects in Sweden with the idea to introduce MR-only radiotherapy, MR-only workflow, and they come up with a very good standardization, which is lived up to today standards as well in terms of standardization. Okay, this one. What is the material for the QA phantom? So usually you have like a specific liquid with a certain proportion of MR visible product. I'm not exactly sure what is the composition, but you can check at the specification of the phantom, or you can ask the supplier to see that one. I know that we received all these phantoms with an extra bottle that if you need to refill. So, but the proper materials, please refer to the supplier of the phantom. Somebody was sending me like a RT scan link. So Aquilab developed a fully automated software model for, yes. That might be probably true. What you have to think about is that there is no, there are some variations that the phantom composition, how it should look like. So even we have the ACR phantom, but I can tell you that certain slices are not as it is expected. So I think that this might be also a question to address as well, like how much variations you see. Next one, do you check the geometry distortion only for one MRI sequence or for multiple sequences using the IBF phantom? We are using it for 3 different bandwidth, because the correction, the applied correction is basically machine specific, but not sequence specific. And then also the detection of the small fiolas, that's also linked to the T1 sequence. Why you want to do T1? Because that's faster than the T2. That's simply as it is. How long? Yeah. Okay. How about the MR distortion phantom from Siemens? Do you know how does it stack against M? Yeah. If you have a different product, so why we selected basically the MR in 3D? That was 2019, and that was the most advanced phantom that was available at that time. That was one of the points. The second point that I want to emphasize is that even if you have a phantom inside the MRI, that means that phantom will distort also the signal that you are getting. So the least materials you are putting into the bore, the better you have the distortion evaluation that is applied for the machine. If you are putting a larger phantom into the bore, then the phantom has also like a magnetic susceptibility that you have to think about. How long does your MRQA protocol takes to complete? So if I provide you this one, sorry. So basically the MR to MV is less than 10 minutes, the PIQT is 15 minutes, the geometric QA phantom and the MR Linac is less than 20 minutes, so these 3 total is less than 1 hour. If we are doing the MR simulator, then the lab Aquarius phantom is basically like few minutes, less than 10. The ACR phantom is like acquisition of 4 or 5 minutes per protocol, so you have like less than 20. The distortion phantom is we have 2 protocols per, so the 3 protocols of bandwidth. This is taking up to 30-35 minutes in total without the setup. How to match CT Hansfield unit to MRI proton density matching tool. We don't do this kind of situation, but I think that we are using synthetic CT, which I think very appropriate to generate a designed and trained Hansfield unit table. I don't know what you really want to do with proton density matching tool and Hansfield unit. I'm not familiar with how you want to assess it. Have you ever had a situation that the MRQA fails in between preventive company maintenances? It's a funny story that, for instance, for the PIQT or the MR2MV is even more interesting. So for the MR2MV test, we had this situation when we positioned the phantom incorrectly, and the MRI tried to accommodate for that. And then basically the pre-scan that was repeated because the message was like RF signal can't be determined, and that was shifted basically the phantom position. So it was acquiring in the right place, but since the distortion is so sensitive that even though this was 15 centimeters or less than 15 centimeters difference, we got the MR images, we got the MV images, and still the result was analyzed properly, but then it was not in the right spot. So it was like out of the tolerance, and then we had to repeat it and we had to explore it. So this is also like a thing that you have to consider, like if something not as planned, just start from scratch, new pre-scan and new acquisition. Okay. Do you run QAs on all your coils? No. We use a few of them in clinical mode, so the 2 flexi coils and then one of the body coils with a long cable. However, we have like the Siemens specific evaluation that you have to basically run certain tests and certain frequency. This is something that the system is automatically checking, and we are just checking that this was performed. So we don't have specific coils. This is also another thing that you have to keep in mind, that the most likely problem that you will face, that the MRI images are not suitable to use. But then either your RTT or your radiation oncologist would complain like they can't see it properly on this MRI. And sometimes it is specific to like, we forgot to connect the coil, or there is a problem with the coil, or there is a problem with the reconstruction. So you have like traces, but those are things that even with the most QA that you are putting ahead, you will not be able to detect it because it will fail at certain moment. But the consequence of the failure is not really severe. If you do MR only planning, how do you ensure the accuracy of the calculation algorithm? That's a different webinar topic, I think. I don't necessarily want to address all the things. Please feel free to contact me by email and I will provide you the information that I have. Do you need to purchase your own water phantom for the MR Linac system? The distributor mentioned that they can use their water phantoms for beam data. Okay. My personal advice, don't purchase water phantom with your MR Linac system because you will not use it. And if you need to use it, better to rely on the water tank that is coming with the specific vendor team. But again, have reference impact that I don't understand. Have reference impact MR Linac and MR simulator. If you are asking specifically what tools we have an Elekta Unity MR Linac system, and we have the Siemens Magneton Area 1.5 system. So I think that I answered all your questions. If you have any burning questions, there are still few minutes.
Okay, Akush, this is Trudy. We do have some questions that we'd like to ask the audience. If we could take a moment to do that right now, that would be great. Our first question is, do you have an SIM MR Linac in your department? So go ahead and give us your responses. All right. And our second question, if we could go ahead and do that, let's just give it a moment. Does your department share MR with the medical imaging department? Give us a yes or no response on that one. Okay, excellent. And another question for you. Do you feel more empowered, more confident to implement QA for your MR SIM or your MR Linac in your department? Go ahead and give us an answer for that one. Okay. And our final question. Do you want us to get in touch with you for a talk to expert call or meeting? Please give us a response here at this time. Okay. Thank you for participating in that. And I'm afraid that's all the time that we have for today's webinar. If your question hasn't been answered, you will receive a reply by email. So you will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. So on behalf of IBA and Akush, thank you so much for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you very much, and bye-bye.